like to turn to 1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings chapter 18. And like Stephen's devotional, this is a very familiar account, one that's filled with many lessons. I'd like to read verses 30 through verse 40. And Elijah said unto all the people, Come near unto me. And all the people came near unto him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, unto whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be thy name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and made a trench about the altar, as great as could contain 2 measures of seed. And he put the wood in order, cut the bullock in pieces, laid him on the wood, and said, Fill 4 barrels with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. And he said, Do it the second time. And they did it the second time. And he said, Do it the third time. And they did it the third time. And the water ran round about the altar, and he filled the trench also with water. And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood, and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God. And Elijah said unto them, Take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they took them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon, and slew them there. This, of course, is the historical account of Elijah on Mount Carmel. He confronts 850 false prophets and a great host of people. It was a day, it was an event to be remembered. One of the many dramatic acts in the history of Israel, and the most memorable event in Elijah's ministry. In our text, we see Elijah, he's pleading with God to manifest himself in a very illustrious way, in a very convincing way, to manifest himself in such a powerful and miraculous way that it could not be denied that it was God, and that it was the work of God. He's pleading for a manifestation of God, so that all would recognize God for who He is. And that's our subject this morning, seeking an obvious, miraculous manifestation of God. If we were to review our lives, there have been a few occasions in our lives where God manifests Himself in such a way that it had a lifelong impact upon us. Sadly, those times have been few. But it's something that we ought to always long for. Most of God's people, I'm convinced, are scared of God. They're scared of a manifestation of God that would upend their lives, that would upset their plans, that would change them. Oh, they want their problems changed. There's no question about that. But there aren't many that really want a life change and want their lives upended. And that's the type of manifestation of God that we're speaking about. We ought to pray for that. We ought to pray for that every day, that God would manifest Himself in such a way. So let's first of all just set the stage for this event. We see from verses 19 and 20 that the event takes place on Mount Carmel, which was a range of mountains located in the land that had been allocated to the tribe of Issachar. It was a place that would have been so situated that the people could come from all parts of the kingdom without any difficulty. The background leading up to the text, we all know that Elijah ministered during the northern kingdom of Israel, during the reign of Ahab, who was the seventh king in a succession of wicked kings over the northern kingdom of Israel. When the nation was divided, when Israel was divided, the people of the northern kingdom immediately departed from God, beginning with the reign of their first king, Jeroboam. And this only escalated and only intensified, leading into the reign of Ahab. And you could say that Ahab was really the incarnation. Him and his wife were the incarnation of evil. And we read of their evil in 1 Kings 16, verses 31 through 33. But Ahab's influence, coupled with that of his Baal-worshiping wife, Jezebel, had been a blight upon the entire kingdom. And now the kingdom is in a deplorable spiritual condition. The altars of God have been torn down. We gather that from verse 30. And the images of Baal and Ashtaroth were everywhere. All through the valleys were temples of idolatry. Everywhere you could find these things. Spiritual darkness reigned throughout the land. And in chapter 17 and verse 1, Elijah, the prophet of God, appears before wicked King Ahab and declares to him that judgment would be upon all the land. There shall not be dew nor rain. And this, of course, was the result of their departure from God. Now, during this time of drought and famine, God would miraculously sustain Elijah at the brook Cherith, and then again in Zarephath, and we read of that in chapter 17. In the third year of the drought, the third year of the famine, God instructs Elijah to again go to Ahab, chapter 18, verse 1, with this message: I will send rain upon the earth. From chapter 18 and verse 2, the famine was now quite severe, very painful. It was a sore famine. People were suffering. You can imagine 3 years with no rain, 3 years with no dew. It was while Elijah was on his way to Ahab with this message that rain is coming, that God led Ahab to call his governor, who was Obadiah, who also was a man whom the Lord placed in Ahab's cabinet, if you will. And he was a man who feared God. He was a man who feared the Lord greatly. We read in 1 Kings 18, verse 3. In fact, he had secretly hid and sustained 100 prophets of God. Well, Ahab says to Obadiah in verse 5, we have to find some water. We have to find some grass, or the horses and the mules are going to die. We cannot lose our livestock. We cannot lose this. And in verse 6, we see Ahab goes one way and Obadiah the other, and they're both searching for grass and water. So it's a very dire situation. In verse 7, Elijah, on his way to Ahab, meets Obadiah. You see God's providence in all of this. He meets Obadiah and he says to Obadiah, you go and tell Ahab that Elijah is here. In verse 16, Obadiah goes to Ahab, and then Ahab goes out to meet Elijah. In verse 17, Ahab immediately accuses Elijah of being the problem. You're the reason for this famine. You're the reason why it has not rained. And in verse 18, Elijah says to Ahab, basically, you are the problem. You are the problem. In that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam. In verse 19, Elijah, no doubt, by the direction of God, issues a challenge to Ahab. And that gives us just a brief background leading up to the event that is recorded here in our text. So, consider the scene. The event that is about to take place, the one that we read of, the backdrop is apostasy, idolatry, wickedness, immorality, and abomination. Following the challenge of Israel, or of Elijah to Ahab, notice verse 20. So Ahab sent all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together unto Mount Carmel. And you picture the scene. There are no doubt thousands of people. There's Ahab and his entourage and their proud wickedness. There are the 850 false prophets, agents of Satan. And there they are in their abominable defiance and irreverence toward God. And there are the ordinary people of Israel who sadly had departed from God, had departed from God's ways, and had been duped and drawn into the ways of Baal. And they've gone through 3 years of famine. And they're looking for solutions. They're looking for remedies. They're looking for deliverance. They're looking for peace. They're looking for answers. They're looking for solutions to their problems. Looking for that which would better their lives. But they're looking in all the wrong places. They're looking in the lies and deceits of that which is futile and useless and empty and hopeless. Much like today. Much like today's society. Looking for answers, but looking in all the wrong places. Looking at that crowd that had gathered upon Mount Carmel, you see a picture of spiritual blindness and spiritual ignorance. I often think about that when you're in a large group of people or you see a large mass of people. All the blindness, all the ignorance that is manifest. Now I'm sure that this people assembled that day in great eagerness, thinking perhaps that they were about to witness the miracle of long hoped for rain. So they're there, they're excited, they're perhaps thinking perhaps Elijah will pray and God would send the rain and their sufferings would end. So you observe the crowd. But something else we must observe in verse 30. Over here is a broken down altar. Broken down altar. The altar of God. The place where confession and contrition was to take place. But it's broken down. Hadn't been used for a long time. It was a place where an Israelite would meet with God. But it was broken down. It's a place of prayer. It's a place of fellowship with God, a place of surrender, a place of consecration to God. But it's broken down. Hadn't been used. It's a place of worship, place of praise, but it's broken down. So you have the people that then look at that broken down altar of the Lord. It's a solemn witness that God's people had departed from the Lord. That brings us to the event upon Mount Carmel. Elijah faces the general population of Israel. In verse 21, and Elijah came unto all the people. And he faces and he addresses the general population of Israel. And he says, how long halt ye between two opinions? With that statement, he immediately reveals their problem. And he reveals their need. How long halt ye between two opinions? So Elijah is looking at a people who had a divided allegiance in their lives. That never works. Never. Jesus said that. Elijah was looking upon a people who were disobedient, who were indifferent, and no doubt they enjoyed the title, the people of God. That's their title. We are the people of God. That's their title. They like that title. But on the other hand, they love the sensual and the fleshly appeal of Baal worship. They had been drawn by and were now under the power and the influence and the sway of the carnal. They enjoyed their title, the people of God, but they also craved the approval and favor of Ahab and Jezebel. They had been taught to worship God only, to walk in His ways, to follow His paths, to have no other gods before Him. Jezebel comes along and introduces Baal worship. And now, out of fear of God, they do not want to let go of God entirely. nor do they want to let go of Baal and infuriate Ahab and Jezebel. So they try to fit both into their lives. And the result was the altar of God was broken down. And the altars of Baal were established throughout the land. Even amongst God's people, the worship of Baal was very popular and was becoming more and more widespread. And the worship of God was unpopular, all but gone in reality. So Elijah is looking at a people who had vacillated in their sentiments and conduct, trying to accommodate themselves to both, trying to secure the favor of both. Here are people who are half-hearted. They're undecided. They're unconcerned as well. They were torn between conflicting ideas, between conflicting philosophies. They were torn between two ways of thinking, the spiritual and the secular, the spiritual and the religious. As a result, the altar of God is broken down. They have no peace. They have no comfort. They have no joy. Their lives are filled with confusion. Their lives are filled with turmoil. Sound familiar? The truth is that Elijah is there in Mount Carmel that day for them. He's there for the people of God. This isn't just about Elijah and the false prophets. He's there for the people of God. And Elijah asked these people, "How long halt ye between two opinions?" That is, how long are you going to totter back and forth between God and Baal? He is saying for nearly 3.5 years. No rain has fallen. Your cattle are dead and dying. Your fields are parched. Your land is covered with dust. How long are you going to continue in your ways of wavering between God and Baal? And then Elijah insisted upon a distinction. He said, "If the Lord be God, follow Him. But if Baal, then follow him." He's saying, make up your mind. Get on one side or the other. Quit going back and forth. If God be God, follow Him. If not, if you think Baal is God, then follow him. But do one or the other. So on the one side, there is God, and on the other side there is Baal. On the one side, there is that which has been proved to be unsatisfying and empty, and ends in sorrow, in disappointment, and famine. On the other side is God. He loves you, He chose you, He redeemed you from Egypt, and He has miraculously provided for you. How long halt ye between two opinions? The response of the people. And the people answer him not a word. That's the response of God's people everywhere. Everywhere I preach, That is the response of God's people overall. They have no answer. They have no answer. They answered him not a word. Oh, there might have been some who said, oh, Elijah, that was great. I appreciated that, Elijah. But no real response. Nothing changed. And that's where we are today. Oh, that was a great message. Appreciated that. But they go out the same way they came in. Or maybe even worse. They answered him not a word. Then Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal. In verse 22, then said Elijah unto the people, I, even I only, remain a prophet of the Lord. Now that wasn't true, but that's how Elijah saw it. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. 450 men. So he calls attention to the odds. And then in verses 23 and 24, he issues a challenge to the false prophets. He tells them to go first. And they were to choose their bullock, place it upon the altar of Baal. And then in verse 26 we read, they called on the name of Baal from morning even until noon, saying, O Baal, O Baal, hear us. But notice that there was no voice, nor any that answered. Never was when people called on the Baal. And the prophets of Baal became more desperate. Verse 26. And they leaped upon the altar which was made. And they continued to cry out, Baal! Baal, hear us! It says in verse 28 that as they did so, they cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out upon them. This is quite a scene. The noon hour passes, and they continue. In verse 29, there was neither voice, nor any answer, nor any that regarded. Then notice the action of Elijah. Verse 30, where we began our text, Elijah said unto all the people, come near unto me. They gather around Elijah. He obviously was standing where the broken down altar of the Lord was. Because we read, and all the people came near unto him, and then notice, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. And as he took those 12 stones and rebuilt the altar of the Lord, that alone should have pierced their hearts and caused them to cry out to God in repentance. But they needed something more than just a reminder of a broken down altar. They needed a manifestation of God. In rebuilding the altar of God, Elijah is showing them where they need to get back to. He's not saying anything, he's just rebuilding that altar. But again, this is a people that needed more than a subtle reminder. So it is today. Just a reminder isn't going to do for God's people. That's not what's going to revive God's people. God's people have reminders every Wednesday, every Sunday, and every day of their lives. but it makes a little difference in the overall picture. They needed a miraculous manifestation of God. So after the altar was rebuilt, verse 32, he made a trench. Began to dig a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 measures of seed. That's 1/3 of a bushel, or about 13 quarts. And then verse 33, he put the wood in order. Again, all the people are watching this. He cut the bullock in pieces, laid him on the wood. And then he issued a command. Verse 33. Fill 4 barrels with water. Now think about that. Hasn't rained for 3.5 years. Water's pretty precious. You fill it 4 barrels with water and then pour it upon the burnt sacrifice in the wood. Can you imagine the reaction of the people? What a waste. That water is very needed. And you're just going to pour it out upon the wood, upon the bullock. Verse 34, this was done 3 times. 12 barrels of water poured upon the sacrifice and the wood, filling the trench. The reason for all of this was so that when God acted, Elijah knew he would. The reason was when God acted, there would be no doubt that it was God. That's what we need today. We need such a manifestation of God that there be no doubt it was of God. In verse 36, it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Elijah steps forth and begins to pray. And he's praying that God would manifest himself in such a way that he would be glorified. He says, "Let it be known this day that thou art God." We need to pray that every day. Concerning ourselves, concerning this nation, concerning society, let it be known this day that thou art God. He's praying that God would manifest himself in such a way that the people would know him. Notice verse 37. That this people may know that thou art God. Because the truth is, they're vacillating between God and Baal. They had forgotten who God was. God's people often do that. We forget just who God is. And we need to be reminded. So we praise that this people may know that thou art God. He's praying that God would manifest himself in such a way that the people would turn back to God. Notice verse 37. That thou hast turned their heart back again. He is revealing their problem. You have forgotten God. You have forgotten who God is. And therefore your heart has departed from God. And He has revealed their need. God needs to show you who He is. Elijah couldn't do that. Only God could. And so it is today. And then we read in verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell. Now, this was a supernatural fire. First of all, it came from above. It's a supernatural fire. It consumed the pieces of the sacrifice, and then it consumed the wood on which the sacrifice had been laid, and even the 12 stones of the altar were consumed. Then the fire of the Lord fell. And the fire had an immediate and direct impact upon the sacrifice, upon the wood, upon the stones, upon the dust, and upon the water in the trench. There was a manifestation of the consuming power of God. Then the fire of the Lord fell. And this had an immediate and direct impact upon the people. Notice verse 39 and 40. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God." Oh, for a manifestation from God that would cause people to immediately fall. They can't do anything else. And cry out, "The Lord, He is God," because most of God's people have forgotten that. I realize it's in our doctrinal statements. I realize that. God is God, but most have forgotten it. It no longer has an impact upon lives. So we need this manifestation from God. And then we see the people went away different than when they arrived. All because of a manifestation of God. Had it just stopped with Elijah rebuilding a broken down altar, which served as a reminder of the condition of the people and what they needed, nothing would have happened. People would have left just the way they came. And it happened. Well, how do you know that? Because it happens every Sunday, it happens every Wednesday. It's been going on for hundreds of years. We need a direct manifestation of God. So let's make some application. The drought and famine during Elijah's day very much parallels our day and the days of many. Days that have resulted in ruin. There are a lot of things that have been ruined in my lifetime. And then you can go beyond that. Ruined because of sin. Ruined because of the coldness of God's people. Destitution. Loss. Emptiness. Affliction. Chaos. Restlessness. Sorrow. Heartache. Stress. Gloom. These are everywhere. And the scene on Mount Carmel very much parallels that. At Mount Carmel, we see godlessness. We see abomination. And looking at the people gathered that day on Mount Carmel, very much parallels many of God's people today. Oh, they like their title. We're the people of God. We're Baptist. We're New Testament Baptist. Oh, they like the title. But the truth is, They're mesmerized and seduced by the world's ways. And they've been dazzled by all the tinsel and all the gaieties and the follies and the vanities of that which is false and ruinous. And their foolish hearts have been deceived. And they crave the attractions and pleasures of a world that has gone absolutely insane. That is God's people today, for the most part. The problem is not government. The problem is not circumstances. The problem is God's people. That's the problem. And the only thing that'll fix it is for God to manifest Himself in such a way that it causes an immediate, life-changing impact upon the people of God. Elijah said to those of God's people, "How long halt ye between two opinions?" How long? They were dissatisfied with their life. Look at people today, saved or unsaved. There aren't many that are satisfied with their life. They're surrounded by their wicked friends. Here's a people. Perhaps Joe over here has not followed Baal, but he's hanging around with Fred and Hank or whoever. And they follow Baal, and it becomes normal to Joe. That's what happens. Things that are sinful become normalized. When that happens, there's indifference. There's coldness. When that happens, whether you realize it or not, you halt between two opinions. And that's been going on for a long time. So here's a people who really are afraid of altering their conduct because they don't want to upset so-and-so. And they begin to trifle with sin, lest they should give offense to their godless companions and bring opposition into their lives. So they make sinful compromises. And they deny God's claims upon their lives. So like many of God's people, these who gathered that day on Mount Carmel, they claim to be the people of God, but their lives are not clearly marked for God. That's why Elijah said, "How long halt ye between two opinions?" When Elijah said that, and when he said, "If the Lord be God, follow Him. If Baal, follow him," he's saying, he's insisting upon a clear distinction. We need that today. Our lives need to be clearly distinct from the world. It doesn't mean that we ignore people's problems and their needs and cease to be a witness. It means just the opposite. Whether you realize it or not, when the distinction is broke down, the witness is broken down as well. There is no witness if there is no distinction. It's a great need of our day. So there's Elijah in the midst of spiritual decline, distance, detachment from God, and he's greatly burdened for this people. And he desired their hearts be turned back to God, so he prayed. Let it be known this day that thou art God. When you pray for another individual, that's a good prayer to pray. Manifest yourself in their life, that they may know that you are God. We all need that. We need it every day. That this people may know that thou art the Lord. God's people in Elijah's day, like many today, have lost sight of who God is. And Elijah just prays for a manifestation of God. And there was an immediate impact made. And so it is today. Remember, you go back, the people answered him not a word. They were unresponsive. They were unresponsive. That's the general response of God's people everywhere. Unresponsive to the message of God. That needs to change. And there's only one thing that'll change it. And that's God. God manifesting Himself in a mighty way. Preachers, through the decades, through the years, due to the unresponsiveness of man, they come up with a variety of ways to get people to respond. Well, there's a couple things wrong with that. Number one, it's not your job to get people to respond. Number two, if you are able to get people to respond, it's false. It's not a real response. It's not a sincere response. That's why people change for a couple days and then go back to their old ways. It's not real. What is real is when God manifests Himself in such a way that no one can deny this is of God. God is moving in our midst. That is what we so desperately need today. A manifestation, a miraculous manifestation of God. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in a verse of song.